If you enjoy detailed investigations into real cases, make sure to subscribe to Grave Case Files. Every story we cover delves into hidden truths, unexplained events, and the dark corners of history, stories you won't find anywhere else. Stay with us as we uncover another gripping case. October 14, 1856. The air in the outskirts of Natchez, Mississippi, carried a chill unusual for mid-autumn. Mist clung low to the ground, rising from the swollen banks of the Mississippi River, curling through the groves of oak and magnolia like pale smoke. From a distance, the plantation houses stood silent, their whitewashed walls glinting faintly in the gray morning light, while nearby, the fields lay bare, trampled and quiet after the season's harvest. It was in this quiet, in this deceptive calm, that a chain of events began which would unsettle the lives of all involved, leaving questions that would linger long after the facts were recorded. At the center of this unfolding story was a woman known to the people of Natchez only as Leila. She was in her mid-20s, a slave on the Turner plantation. Descriptions from those who had seen her recalled her as quiet, measured, and unassuming, hardly the type to draw attention. Yet beneath this outward calm, she carried a resolve that would ultimately challenge the rigid structures that bound her. She had been working the fields since dawn, tending to the remaining crops, when she disappeared without warning. No one had seen her leave, and yet, by that afternoon, it became clear that she was gone. Her absence did not go unnoticed for long. The Turner family, concerned for the value of their labor force, dispatched a group of men to track her. Among them were white bounty hunters, men who specialized in pursuing escaped slaves for profit. These hunters were methodical, skilled, and relentless, familiar with the terrain and the habits of those they pursued. For them, this was routine business, a straightforward case to be resolved with efficiency. But Leila was not a typical fugitive. Unknown to her pursuers, she had allies and a network that extended beyond the plantation's immediate reach. Among them was Elijah Freeman, a free black gunslinger whose reputation preceded him in quiet whispers. He was a man of few words, his presence commanding respect and caution. Unlike the bounty hunters, he had no interest in profit from the capture of Leila. His motives were anchored in principle, in a personal code that would soon put him directly in conflict with those hunting her. By mid-morning, the first signs of pursuit became apparent. The bounty hunters moved with quiet precision, their horses leaving tracks in the moist earth that cut through the fog. Each man carried his own method of tracking, a compass, a coil of rope, a pistol at the ready, but together they operated as a single, calculated unit. It was the kind of professionalism born of repeated experience, of countless escapes they had seen and countless they had prevented. Reports from locals would later indicate that Leila had not fled recklessly. She had chosen her path with care, weaving through thickets and streams and leaving behind only the faintest traces of her passage. Yet for the hunters, even a trace was enough. They moved in disciplined formations, scanning every tree line, listening for every sound that might betray her presence. Their pace was slow, measured, because haste often led to mistakes. In this, they were patient predators, and for a time, it seemed that the chase itself had become its own quiet rhythm, a dangerous dance between hunter and hunted. Unknown to them, Elijah Freeman had already begun shadowing their movements. His approach was deliberate. He did not confront directly, not yet. Instead, he used the terrain as an advantage, observing from concealed positions, interpreting the patterns of the hunter's search. In later testimonies from those who would only learn of his involvement years afterward, Elijah's actions were described as almost surgical. He intervened at precise moments, removing small obstacles, guiding Leila's movements without ever revealing himself. By noon, the hunters had reached the edge of a small ravine near the Cypress Creek. The ground here was marshy, dotted with hidden sinkholes and dense undergrowth. One of the men, a man named Harris, paused, squinting at a pattern in the mud that suggested recent passage. "She went this way," he said quietly, motioning to the east. The others nodded, their faces taut with focus. But even as they moved, there was an unease in their rhythm, a sense that they were being watched, or that the terrain itself conspired against them. Small disturbances, branches bent unnaturally, footprints that faded too quickly, led to whispers among the hunters that something was different about this pursuit. It was during this stretch that the first witness account was recorded. A local farmer, Mr. Callahan, would later recall seeing a young woman moving swiftly along the creek's edge. He described her as deliberate, calculated, yet there was a tension in her stride, a constant vigilance. "I didn't dare call out," he said, "but she looked ready, like she knew someone was behind her." Callahan's testimony would later be compared with that of one of the bounty hunters, whose own account of the same stretch of land suggested a different pattern entirely, raising the first discrepancies in the official record. The afternoon brought further complications. The hunters split into smaller groups to cover more ground. One party followed the creek, while another moved through the wooded rise above it. In these hours, subtle contradictions began to emerge. Reports of where the tracks led conflicted. A horse's hoofprint suggested one direction, a broken branch suggested another. It was the first indication that the chase was not simply a matter of speed or skill, but of understanding an opponent who refused to behave predictably. At this juncture, it became clear that someone, or something, was interfering with the hunt. Horses became unsettled, items left along the path disappeared, and the hunters found themselves unexpectedly encountering dead ends. Unbeknownst to them, Elijah Freeman was orchestrating these small diversions. He never appeared in direct confrontation but used tools, knowledge of the land, and psychological pressure to guide Leela away from danger. Each misstep the hunters made, each moment of frustration, added to the slow build of tension, a tension that would escalate in the hours to come. It was during one of these misdirections that the first major reveal occurred. A small bundle of supplies left along the creek, a satchel with food and water, was discovered by the hunters who assumed it belonged to Leela. Inside, they found a note, brief and unassuming, a single line written in charcoal on paper, stating simply, "You are following shadows." The hunters were unsettled. There was no sign of a person, no trace of who had left it, only the implication that someone was observing them, anticipating their movements. If you appreciate detailed investigations like this, you're watching Grave Case Files. Subscribe and join us for more real case deep dives. Here, every discovery is examined, every contradiction explored, and every shadow follows a story that history has almost forgotten. The remainder of the day unfolded with increasing tension. Leela moved with precision, guided by Elijah's careful interference. Each creek crossing, each choice of cover, and each change in pace reflected both her instinct and his subtle guidance. The hunters, meanwhile, grew more frustrated with every misstep, their confidence shaken. For men who had faced countless escapees, this pursuit was unlike any other. They were contending with a fugitive who not only evaded them, but seemed to manipulate the very environment against them. As night approached, the fog returned, thicker than before. Visibility dropped to mere feet in some areas, and sounds became distorted echoes across the marsh. The hunters made camp near the creek, their movements cautious. They were wary now, sensing an unseen intelligence at work. Some whispered about the possibility of local sympathizers aiding the fugitive, while others suggested darker, more irrational explanations, superstition, fear, or exhaustion clouding judgment. By the time darkness fully descended, Leela had reached a small grove several miles away. Exhausted yet alert, she paused to assess the land, the direction of the creek, and the faint traces left behind. It was here that the next phase of the pursuit would begin, one that would test the limits of both her endurance and the skills of those who sought to capture her. Nightfall deepened over the Mississippi lowlands. The dense fog had returned in heavier swathes, curling between the trees like living fingers, making the familiar paths nearly unrecognizable. From their encampment by the creek, the bounty hunters tried to maintain a semblance of order, but unease had crept into their ranks. Each man took turns on watch, their eyes scanning the shifting shadows, their ears straining for the faintest sound of movement. There was no sign of Leela, yet the evidence of her passage, subtle depressions in the soil, displaced leaves, broken twigs, was enough to remind them that the hunt was far from over. Harris, the tracker who had first identified her direction, began questioning the reliability of his observations. The mud that had clearly indicated movement earlier now seemed ambiguous, tracks fading or appearing where none should be. One man murmured almost to himself that they might be following ghosts. Others laughed nervously, but the unease persisted, a tension born not of fear of the unknown, but of frustration at being outmaneuvered by someone they had underestimated. Meanwhile, Leela had found temporary refuge in a thicket near the edge of the swamp. Her movements were cautious but deliberate. Every step was calculated to minimize sound and avoid leaving traces that could be followed. She had learned the basics of survival from whispered lessons from older slaves on the plantation: how to read the land, how to use the wind, how to blend with shadows. Tonight, these skills were not just practical, they were a matter of life and death. Elijah Freeman observed from a hidden ridge above, his silhouette obscured by the darkness. He had chosen this position intentionally. From here, he could see the hunters' camp, note their movements, and intercept any path they might attempt. He had left subtle markers earlier in the day, slight disturbances in the leaves, altered footprints, to guide Leela away from danger. He would do more tonight. He would ensure that when they woke, the hunters would follow a trail that led nowhere. By early morning, confusion had begun to set in among the hunters. Some reported seeing tracks that seemed to split and converge simultaneously, footprints that contradicted earlier findings, and shadows that moved where no person could be present. Arguments broke out over the correct path. Harris maintained his initial direction, insisting that the tracks were real, while another hunter, Douglas, suggested that the fugitive might have doubled back, using the swamp's labyrinthine channels to her advantage. The disagreements were subtle but telling, evidence that the hunters' confidence was beginning to erode. Local residents who had been aware of the search reported odd occurrences. Chickens scattered from empty yards, dogs barked at nothing, and an old miller claimed to see a figure moving between trees at dawn. Too quick to be human, he said, and too deliberate to be a trick of the mind. These accounts, when later compiled, painted a picture of a pursuit that had grown almost surreal, a chase where ordinary logic seemed to falter against the cunning of the pursued. The next phase of the hunt involved crossing a narrow stretch of swamp known for hidden sinkholes and treacherous footing. Here, the hunters' horses struggled, sinking into mud up to their knees. One hunter nearly fell, saved only by the rope of a companion. The physical strain added to the psychological tension. It was in moments like this, when exhaustion and fear intersected, that mistakes became inevitable. Elijah had anticipated this. He had observed the hunters, likely pathed the previous evening, and subtly redirected Leela around the most hazardous areas, ensuring she remained unseen while allowing the hunters to face the swamp's natural obstacles. By late afternoon, reports from the hunters began showing clear contradictions. Harris claimed they had found fresh tracks leading east. Douglas insisted those tracks were old and likely deceptive. A third man, Peterson, noted that some marks appeared to be deliberately placed to confuse them, footprints leading nowhere, broken branches indicating false directions. None of the men could explain why these irregularities existed. It would later become evident that Elijah's subtle manipulations had created these discrepancies. But at the time, the hunters only felt frustration and rising anxiety. Leela, meanwhile, moved with increasing awareness of time and space. She knew that her survival depended not on fleeing blindly, but on understanding the hunters' psychology. She observed their habits, anticipated where they would check first, and deliberately left false traces to mislead them. Every careful step she took was informed not only by instinct, but by knowledge imparted in whispered lessons from those who had escaped before her. The tension of the chase culminated near a small grove of cypress trees by the river's edge. Here, The hunters had cornered what they assumed to be a trail. They spread out, weapons raised, scanning every shadow, listening to every rustle of leaves. Hours passed with no sign of movement, only the occasional bird startled into flight. Some began to whisper about a mysterious protector, a figure who might be assisting the fugitive. Others dismissed the notion, attributing the difficulty to the terrain alone. At this point, Elijah made his presence known indirectly. He had created a diversion, a fallen tree across a critical path, forcing the hunters to waste valuable time rerouting. In later investigations, the significance of this act would be highlighted. It was the first tangible evidence that someone was actively intervening on Leela's behalf, not merely that she was clever, but that she had an ally with knowledge, skill, and the willingness to act. The evening descended once more, thick with fog. Leela found shelter near a hidden creek bend, exhausted but alert. The hunters, unaware of her proximity, continued their search into the night. Each misstep, each failed effort, added to the mounting tension and uncertainty, prolonging the chase and deepening the mystery surrounding her escape. It was during this period that the investigators, later compiling reports for newspapers, legal records, and informal accounts, began noting the unusual nature of the pursuit. Multiple witness statements contradicted each other. Hunters' logs conflicted with their recollections. Time and distance measurements failed to align. Something about this case defied standard explanation, suggesting not only human cunning, but a combination of skill, planning, and perhaps an almost uncanny understanding of human behavior. The following morning, the swamp seemed almost alive, mist rising from every low point in thick coils that obscured vision and distorted sound. The hunters, still disoriented from the previous day's misdirections, advanced with caution, their formation tighter, their voices lower. Each man seemed aware that they were being tested, their confidence tempered by the strange inconsistencies in the tracks and the subtle manipulations they could not see. They had expected a fugitive, a woman fleeing in desperation, but instead they found an adversary who seemed to anticipate their every move. Leela moved deliberately through the dense undergrowth, her bare feet silent on the wet earth, her breathing controlled. Each step was calculated, each pause intentional. She used natural landmarks to mask her movements. She ducked beneath overhanging branches, crossed shallow streams to erase footprints, and chose paths that forced the hunters to expend energy without making progress. In these choices, the lessons of survival passed down through generations became tangible. They were not just about hiding, but about outthinking those who pursued. By mid-morning, the hunters split once more to cover more ground. This decision would later be scrutinized in reports as the first major tactical error. Harris and Douglas took one route along the river's edge, while Peterson and a third man advanced through a series of ridges leading into the swamp's interior. Within hours, communication between the groups became sporadic. Shouted directions were muffled by fog and distance, and assumptions replaced verified observations. Leela, observing from concealed positions, exploited this division. She left traces, footprints, and disturbed brush that suggested movement in one direction, drawing one party further from the other. At approximately noon, the first confrontation occurred, though it was indirect. Harris spotted movement among the trees, faint and fleeting. A shadow shifted and he raised his rifle, but by the time he aimed, nothing remained but rustling leaves. He called out to the others, claiming they were near her, but by the time Douglas and Peterson arrived, the area was empty. No footprints led forward, no trace of her path remained. Frustration began to mount. Elijah Freeman observed silently from a ridge above, calculating the hunters' reactions. He had anticipated that splitting the group would create confusion, and it had worked exactly as intended. He did not intervene directly. His role was to guide, to protect, to manipulate the pursuit subtly. In later accounts, investigators would note the efficiency and precision of these actions, though at the time, the hunters could only feel the rising anxiety, and the sense that the landscape itself conspired against them. Meanwhile, Leela paused to assess her surroundings. She had traveled nearly 10 miles since first escaping the plantation, yet she remained alert, aware that her window of safety was narrowing. She knew the hunters' methods, their likely patience, their tendency to follow the most obvious paths. She used this knowledge to her advantage, doubling back when necessary, taking advantage of every bend in the terrain and every natural obstruction. Each decision reduced the risk of discovery and increased the strain on those pursuing her. By late afternoon, evidence of Elijah's interference became more apparent to the hunters. A horse saddle that had been left unattended appeared to have been tampered with. Small markers in the trees indicated deliberate manipulation of the environment. Harris, observing the subtleties, whispered to Douglas that they were dealing with someone or something that was guiding the fugitive. Douglas dismissed the suggestion at first, but the mounting irregularities forced even him to acknowledge that this was no ordinary pursuit. Local residents reported further unusual occurrences. A fisherman noted seeing a figure move along the riverbank with unnatural speed. A mill worker claimed that shadows seemed to shift in ways inconsistent with the setting sun. While these accounts were often dismissed at the time as exaggeration or misperception, they would later be considered credible pieces of evidence illustrating the unusual nature of the chase. As night fell, the hunters regrouped near a narrow channel that cut through the swamp. Exhaustion weighed heavily on each man, their nerves frayed, and their senses heightened by anticipation. They lit small fires for warmth and began reviewing their positions and notes. Harris noted that tracks that had seemed clear in the morning had disappeared entirely, while Douglas argued that some signs suggested deliberate misdirection. Peterson remained silent, studying the terrain, unsettled by an intuition he could not articulate. Meanwhile, Leela found shelter in a natural alcove formed by roots and overhanging branches. She rested briefly, drinking from a hidden stream, but remained vigilant. Elijah watched from a concealed position nearby, noting the hunters' campfires flickering in the distance. He had guided her to this location precisely because it allowed her to remain hidden while the hunters' attention remained elsewhere. By the time dawn approached, she would be several miles ahead, yet the hunters, unaware of the full extent of her movements, would continue searching within a confined area, unknowingly retracing paths she had already abandoned. The psychological tension among the hunters intensified. Each missed opportunity, each failed observation, added to an unspoken anxiety. They began to question the reliability of their own instincts, the accuracy of the tracks, and even the competence of one another. By the third day of pursuit, what had begun as a routine hunt for an escaped slave had evolved into a disorienting contest of wits and patience. A test of endurance, observation, and perception that would leave lasting marks on those involved. The fifth day of pursuit brought a relentless intensity to the swampland surrounding Natchez. Mist hung thick over the lowlands once again, the gray veil of fog creating illusions of movement among trees and shadows. The hunters, now visibly exhausted, moved cautiously, their pace slowed by the treacherous terrain and the mental strain of the hunt. Every step was calculated, yet every misstep seemed inevitable. Harris, who had begun the pursuit with quiet confidence, now moved with a tense deliberation, questioning even the most basic assumptions about the land and the fugitive. Leela had learned to read the environment like a living map. She used the shifting patterns of the sun, the direction of the wind, and the subtle shifts in vegetation to erase her trail. She knew the hunters expected her to follow the most direct route, but she avoided it at every turn, crossing shallow streams backward, doubling upon herself in narrow clearings, and using fallen logs to obscure footprints. She left behind a trail that confused even the most skilled trackers. Each action was deliberate, each moment designed to maintain the advantage while conserving her strength. By midday, the hunters began to realize that they were being manipulated. Small details, a branch broken in a particular way, A footprint that appeared older than it should have been suggested that someone was actively guiding Leela, shaping the environment to her advantage. Harris noted the inconsistencies aloud, and for the first time some of the men began to speculate about the possibility of outside assistance. "This isn't just skill," he muttered. "Someone's planning this." Douglas scoffed initially, but could not dismiss the repeated contradictions in their observations. Elijah Freeman continued to work in silence, maintaining a careful distance while monitoring the hunters' movements. His interventions became more precise. He removed evidence that could directly lead to Leela, redirected the hunters' attention with subtle manipulations of the terrain, and ensured that she remained several steps ahead. Every calculated interference was recorded in his memory for later reflection, but at the moment, it existed only in the hidden patterns of the landscape, invisible to those chasing her. Local witnesses reported strange occurrences during the afternoon. A farmer tending fields noted the impression of someone walking through the tall grass, yet when he approached, no one was there. A child playing near the edge of the swamp saw a figure move across a clearing with unnatural speed and control, vanishing as if swallowed by the shadows. These observations were compiled later, forming part of the fragmented record of the hunt, illustrating the almost ghostly precision of Leela's movements and the unseen hand guiding her. As the day wore on, Leela encountered her first significant obstacle, a heavily patrolled section of swamp where two hunters had stationed themselves to intercept any movement. Observing from a concealed position, she waited, analyzing their patrol patterns, their timing, and even the subtle habits of the horses. She realized that rushing through would likely result in confrontation, yet staying too long risked being trapped. The solution was neither speed nor avoidance, but patience, a delay that forced the hunters to make assumptions about her position and movement. She moved only when the timing was optimal, slipping silently past their sentries while leaving behind carefully constructed misdirections. Harris and Douglas, meanwhile, grew increasingly tense. By late afternoon, they had encountered signs that seemed to contradict their earlier findings. Footprints appeared to lead in directions that were impossible given the terrain. Broken branches suggested someone had been where no human could have reached. These contradictions were noted in their logs, though they did little to clarify the situation. Instead, they heightened anxiety and created friction within the group, subtle disagreements over interpretation and strategy. Elijah Freeman observed all of this with meticulous care. Each hunter's reaction, each choice made under pressure, was calculated and anticipated. He used the hunters' own assumptions against them, predicting where they would focus attention, and directing Leela to move in the opposite direction. At no point did he expose himself, and at no point did the hunters suspect his presence, though the accumulating anomalies suggested an unseen strategist was at work. Evening fell and the swamp took on a heavier, almost oppressive atmosphere. Sounds were muffled, distorted. The faint crack of twigs echoed unnaturally through the fog. Leela found temporary shelter near a dense thicket, her body weary but her mind alert. She knew that every hour of daylight increased the risk of detection, yet she also understood that the hunters' fatigue worked in her favor. She had anticipated this moment, and by carefully choosing her resting place, she ensured that she could resume movement at first light without being detected. The hunters, huddled near a makeshift fire, debated their next steps. Some argued for a direct search along the riverbanks, convinced that the fugitive would attempt a predictable route. Others suggested splitting into smaller teams to cover more ground. Each argument revealed the growing strain of the hunt and the subtle erosion of confidence among the men. By nightfall, frustration had become palpable. The hunters were no longer merely following a trail, they were reacting to it, struggling to regain control of a situation that seemed to defy their experience. Unseen by any of them, Elijah positioned himself for the next phase of intervention. His careful observations had revealed the hunters' most likely path in the coming hours, and he prepared small diversions. displaced leaves, adjusted footprints, and subtle changes to the terrain that would redirect attention and preserve Leela's safety. Every action was calculated to delay the hunters, to conserve her energy, and to maintain the edge that had allowed her to remain free thus far. As darkness fully settled, the swamp seemed almost to hold its breath. The fog thickened, obscuring vision, muffling sound. Leela rested briefly, drinking from a hidden spring and assessing her route forward. The hunters remained unaware of how close she had come to a trap they did not even know existed. By carefully manipulating both natural and human elements, she had turned the pursuit into a contest of patience, observation, and psychological skill. A contest in which she remained ahead, guided by instinct and the unseen hand of Elijah Freeman. Dawn broke over the Mississippi lowlands on the 6th day of pursuit, pale sunlight slicing through the lingering fog. The swamp was quiet now, almost eerily so, save for the distant caw of a crow and the faint rustle of leaves. The hunters, exhausted and frayed by days of relentless pursuit, had begun to question not only their strategy but the very nature of the chase. The terrain had betrayed them repeatedly, evidence had misled them, and the fugitive remained unseen. What had begun as a straightforward hunt had transformed into an ordeal that tested every skill, instinct, and assumption they possessed. Leela, hidden in a dense thicket near a river bend, observed the hunters' movements from a safe distance. She had traveled nearly 40 miles in the intervening days, navigating the swamps, rivers, and wooded ridges with precision. Her escape had not been a matter of luck. It had been guided by knowledge, instinct, and the careful interventions of Elijah Freeman, whose presence remained invisible but whose influence had been decisive. The hunters, weary and frustrated, attempted one final sweep along the eastern bank of the river. Harris led the effort, convinced that sheer persistence would force Leela into visibility. Douglas and Peterson followed. Scanning for any sign, broken twigs, disturbed mud, a shadow among the trees. Hours passed without success. Every step forward seemed to yield nothing. Every observation contradicted previous assumptions. By mid-afternoon, it became clear that the fugitive had outmaneuvered them entirely. Elijah Freeman remained hidden, allowing the hunters to continue their futile search. He had ensured that Leela's path led away from danger, guiding her toward a safer, less traveled route that would take her beyond the immediate reach of the hunters. By now, he understood that the men chasing her were too entrenched in expectation and routine to adjust effectively. Their mistakes were predictable, and he had used them to full advantage. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Leela paused on a ridge overlooking a clearing where the hunters had last been seen. Exhausted but resolute, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The pursuit had tested every aspect of her being, her endurance, her wits, her courage. Yet she had survived not through chance, but through careful planning, awareness, and the unseen aid of an ally who shared a commitment to justice rather than profit. The hunters, meanwhile, returned to their temporary camp as darkness fell, their morale broken. Harris admitted quietly to the others that they had failed to locate the fugitive. Douglas and Peterson said little, their silence heavy with the realization that they had been outwitted, that a woman fleeing for her freedom had manipulated them in ways they could not fully comprehend. Reports later filed described the pursuit as confounding, the events inexplicable, and the fugitive's disappearance complete. In the days that followed, Leela's fate remained largely unrecorded by official sources, though fragments of oral history suggest she made her way northward, eventually reaching a safe haven among communities that offered protection to those escaping slavery. Elijah Freeman, whose intervention had been decisive, disappeared from the immediate region, leaving behind only whispered accounts of a skilled gunslinger who aided those in peril. Neither would seek recognition. Both acted in accordance with principles rather than personal gain. The hunters' reports, compiled and filed for record, reflected a series of contradictions and anomalies. Footprints that appeared and vanished, evidence that seemed deliberately misleading, and the hunters' own miscalculations were noted repeatedly. In reviewing the case years later, investigators remarked on the exceptional skill of the fugitive and the unseen hand that guided her movements. Some suggested extraordinary cunning, others a combination of strategy and local knowledge. All agreed that the outcome was unlikely to be repeated. Ultimately, the pursuit ended not in confrontation, but in disappearance. Leela's survival and freedom became the final resolution, her story preserved only through fragments of testimony, partial records, and the retelling of those who glimpsed her movement across the swamps. Elijah Freeman's involvement remained largely hidden, his presence inferred only through the pattern of misdirection and the successful outcome. The case, though concluded, left lingering questions. How much of her survival was instinct? How much deliberate planning? And how much the influence of an unseen ally? The documents, witness statements, and surviving accounts suggest a combination of all three, creating a narrative that remains remarkable both for its ingenuity and for the quiet courage of the individuals involved. In the quiet aftermath, the swamp returned to its ordinary rhythms. Mist rose each morning, birds sang, and the water flowed steadily. Yet beneath this normalcy lay the memory of a pursuit unlike any other, one that tested human endurance, intelligence, and morality. The story of Leela, the hunted woman, and Elijah Freeman, the unseen protector, stands as a testament to resilience, strategic thinking, and the hidden forces that can shape history in subtle but profound ways.